Hey, what's up guys? Today, I'll show you a drama film, Dogville. Spoiler ahead, watch out and take care. The movie begins with a prologue introducing a small township with 15 residents called Dogville. Dogville stands at the foot of the Rocky Mountains of the USA, near an old, abandoned silver mine entrance. Across Elm's small street is the writer's residency with his retired father, the doctor with a moderate pension, thus leading the writer to idle and settle into writing. However, he puts off writing by holding a series of moral rearmament meetings for the citizens of Dogville. After fixing his study table, the writer goes out and reminds his neighbor, the caretaker who's cleaning up after impaired June, about the meeting. The writer then walks to Elm Street and comes across the orchardist traveling to his house. The orchardist gets mad upon arriving on his doorstep and seeing a meaty bone on Moses' food bowl. The orchardist's children report their brother, Jason, to their father for giving out scarce meat. The orchardist chides Jason that Moses' purpose is to be hungry and guard. The writer then visits the mission house to check on the prepared benches and ring the bell later at 7 p.m. for his game with the engineer. The pianist replies everything's all set and they could not use the piano without permission from the regional director in the meeting. The writer responds they don't need music or Bible reading to be spiritual. The writer then visits the storekeeper, who's raking and hoeing the soil beside her shop. Just then, the trucker arrives in his pickup truck and parks in his garage. At 7 p.m., the pianist chimes the bell, and the writer meets his childhood friend, the engineer, who's dumb enough to pass as one. Liz, the engineer's older sister, welcomes the writer at the door, reminding him to find another girl to gaze at, before allowing him to enter the house. Upon entering, the writer greets Mrs. Henson and proceeds to the engineer's study table to play checkers. Before the game, the engineer believes the townspeople don't need the lectures. Still, the writer determinedly claims they need an illustration to show the townspeople's difficulty of accepting others other than themselves. Eventually, the writer beats the engineer at checkers and bids goodbye. Chapter 1. The writer strolls through Elm Street as the rain pours down. He hears a gunshot on the canyon road below their town and waits for more, but silence overtakes afterward. He sits on the old lady's bench and somehow misses the temporary danger and eventually sleeps on the bench. The whole town sleeps, and an unfamiliar face, named Grace, comes to town, steals Moses' bones, and climbs the Rocky Mountains. Moses barks at Grace, thus waking up the writer on the bench, and he follows the sound. He prevents her from ascending any further, and Grace requests another location to flee to, but the writer responds that the only exit is the entrance to the town itself. Gangsters in a Cadillac arrive, and Grace begs the writer for a hideout. The writer brings Grace to a nearby mine. Afterward, one of the gangsters asks the writer if he'd seen a blonde woman, but the writer denies this. Before leaving, they offer the writer a prize to entice him, and a phone number written on a card to alert them if Grace shows up. On the following day, the writer uses Grace as the illustration he's looking for to test the townspeople's capability to receive a gift and their willingness to help strangers. During the meeting, the townspeople doubt Grace, so the writer suggests letting Grace stay for 2 weeks to prove herself as a good person. The townspeople accept the offer. Thus, the writer instructs Grace to gain the townspeople's trust and friendship to allow her to stay in Dogville. Chapter 2. Grace follows the writer's instructions to get into the townspeople's hearts. So Grace offers services and chores, for instance, accompanying to the lonesome blind, a babysitter for the orchardist's children, ringing the bell in the mission house, and eventually to the storekeeper's shop. However, they all deny her help, because Dogville's townspeople believe others needed something from them, and it was not them who needed something from others. The storekeeper eventually gives in and offers Grace to rake the soil beside the shop for the gooseberry bushes to grow. Soon, Grace gives food to the trucker, who sleeps in his little barrage. She helps the caretaker with June and accompanies the lonesome blind. She also assists the pianist in turning the music note pages, tutors the engineer in his studies, and cleans the doctor's medicine closet. Later, the townspeople learn to acknowledge Grace to help them in not-so-necessary tasks, which visibly make their lives easier and more comfortable. However, the orchardist remains doubtful of Grace's schemes to the townspeople. So later that night, the writer advises getting into the orchardist is through his wife, the teacher. On the following day, Grace visits the orchardist's house and offers to babysit and teach the children, which the teacher accepts and leaves the town with the trucker. Afterward, Jason confronts Grace about knowing her plans to make people like her. Late at night, the orchardist returns home and catches Grace in his house with the children. It turns out the orchardist is mad at Grace because her presence reminds him of his time in the city. Chapter 3. Grace blissfully continues the paid chores she does every day and uses the hard-earned money she acquires to buy the 7 porcelain figure sets one at a time from the storekeeper's store. Later, Grace becomes friends with some of the townspeople, including the lonesome blind, who pretends he's not blind in his isolated home. However, throughout their conversation, Grace tricks the lonesome blind into admitting he's visionless by removing the drape covering the only window in the cabin and asking him to describe the scenery outside. The following day, the townspeople gather in the mission house to release the verdict on Grace's stay in the town. For Grace to know the result, one bell ring is equivalent to one townsfolk. So Grace goes to the writer's house, and upon retrieving her folded clothes, she finds gifts from all the folks. She brings her belongings to the mine and waits for the result. The bell chimes 14 times, and thus the orchardist must not have voted. Grace then goes to the mountains after the long silence, and upon climbing, another bell chimes, making the count 15. The writer comes out to fetch Grace from the mission house and announces that they all agreed and would like her to stay permanently. Chapter 4. The penis coordinates by chiming the bell to help Grace's schedule. Eventually, Grace becomes the lonesome blind's eye to the outside. She's also a mother for the trucker, friend for the teacher, and the brains for the engineer. Everything is well, and Grace finally moves into the old mill as her new residency. But the peace present in Dogville turns into a creeping fear upon seeing the police post a missing poster, showing Grace's photo and information on the mission house. Later that night, the townspeople gather in the mission house to discuss whether to cooperate with the police or not, causing a sour atmosphere amongst the people. Chapter 5. The town celebrates the 4th of July. The townspeople buzz in the small alleys and streets, decorating the doors and walls. The writer invites Grace to the old lady's bench to confess his love for her. To his surprise, Grace feels the same for him. The two new lovebirds return to the tables to eat with the townspeople. Everyone shares laughter, singing, and toasting Grace's stay in the town to make their lives bright and better. Grace slides her hand to the writer where they hold hands, and Liz catches this small intimate moment of the two. Amidst the celebration, Grace immediately hides in the mines as the police return to replace Grace's missing poster with wanted, because based on the police, Grace was allegedly involved in a bank robbery. The townspeople find this difficult to believe because they've been with her for weeks doing chores for everybody. However, Grace's further stay in the town will only mean Dogville harbors a criminal. So the writer proposes Grace to provide a quid pro quo, meaning favor expected in return for something, and more heavily chores but less pay to the townspeople. Grace at first thinks it's impossible, as it will affect her usual routine, but to please the writer and townspeople, she agrees otherwise. It's evident how Grace's first voluntary services change, where it slightly leans to appease people through little persuasion from the writer. On the following day, Grace follows the new schedule, which worsens the situation with the townspeople because of the heavier workload given to her. During Grace's chores, the people project their frustration due to the new schedule, causing her to make mistakes out of newness and exhaustion. As the night comes, Grace accompanies the orchardist in the orchards. The orchardist suddenly asks why Grace avoids him every time he gets too close, and she replies it's because he attempted to kiss her. The orchardist bellows his emotions to Grace as if something unspoken is going on between them. Grace comforts the orchardist's stretched loneliness in the orchard because his wife couldn't care less about his likes. Afterward, Grace sleeps in her cabin, and she has already collected 5 porcelain figurines. The writer visits her to tell her she's been doing fantastic at her job, but Grace mentions how she's slowly declining in little things. Either way, Grace continues to sleep after their talk. Chapter 6. Grace teaches the children at the orchardist's house. However, Jason displays stubbornness while in class because Grace is not allowing him to sit on her lap. So Grace asks the rest of the children to leave, while she calmly chides Jason. On the other hand, Jason even demands to get spanked because of his unruly behavior. Grace opposes hitting children as a disciplinary punishment. Jason proposes he will not tell his mother if Grace spanks him, but Grace dismisses this. So Jason shoves his baby brother's crib to prompt Grace's anger, which he successfully resurfaces from Grace. Grace spanks Jason, but not that hard. Due to Grace's missing social status and lack of choices, she becomes vulnerable to manipulation. Just then, the orchardist arrives at his house, and Jason immediately leaves. Outside, the police return to Dogville once again, looking for Grace. The orchardist brings out the writer's hat, using it as his way to save Grace from the police. However, he blackmails her, saying he can use Grace's scarf instead as evidence to the police if she starts screaming. The orchardist then advances toward Grace, cornering her in his house, and rapes her. In exchange for her freedom is a stain on her body. Chapter 7. It's midnight, and Grace tearfully shares with the writer the crime. The writer proposes confronting the orchardist's sinful act, but she stops him. Instead, the two formulate a plan for Grace to escape the town. Grace rakes the soil for gooseberry bushes beside the storekeeper's shop the following day. Just then, Liz and the teacher disappointedly confront Grace regarding her spanking to Jason without her permission or knowledge. On the other hand, Liz defends Grace by saying Jason persistently asked for it when she babysat the children before. The teacher leaves, and Liz tells Grace that the townspeople notice the writer leaving her shack late at night, which somehow affects their perception of Grace's virtues. The next evening, Grace sleeps in her shack when suddenly the teacher, the pianist, and Liz visit her. The pianist vouches, saying Grace had seduced the orchardist for a sexual encounter in the apple orchard. This story angers the teacher, so to punish Grace, she will destroy Grace's complete set of porcelain figurines one by one. Grace tries to remind her of Stoicism's philosophy to the teacher's children. However, the teacher wickedly weaponizes Stoicism, saying she will stop smashing the figures if Grace stops crying. However, Grace can't hold back her tears as she watches what she worked hard for get destroyed. After planning her escape with the writer for days, they eventually finalize it. Grace visits the trucker first in the morning, despite the townspeople looking for her to continue her chores. Either way, Grace proceeds to the trucker's garage, bribes him money that came from the writer, and hides underneath the covers of the pickup truck filled with apple crates. Grace lies cold while waiting to get out of Dogville. After a long travel, suddenly the trucker stops the car, saying checkpoints are guarding the streets looking for her, so they need to return. Unfortunately, before returning, the trucker takes advantage of the situation where Grace can't run anywhere, so he humiliates her on the back of the truck. That evening, they arrive back at Dogville, and the trucker reveals they are aware of Grace's plan to escape. Other than that, the townspeople accuse Grace of stealing the doctor's missing money in his medicine cabinet, which is a similar amount she bribed with the trucker. After Grace had attempted an escape, the engineer invents a makeshift anchor to prevent her from fleeing again. They forcefully make her wear Moses' collar with a chain leash bound on a heavy metal wheel. Chapter 8. After chaining down Grace, she returns to her shack accompanied by the writer. The writer admits he stole the money from his father, but passed the blame to Grace to prevent the townspeople from suspecting him of betrayal. Grace is now Dogville's slave with nowhere to go in exchange for the writer's innocence. She's chained down, repeatedly assaulted by men at night, constantly abused by the women at day, and persistently humiliated by the children every time the bell chimes to trick on her. The mistreatment given to Grace hurts the writer's heart when he sees the person he loves ridiculed by everyone he knows ever since. One evening, the writer visits Grace, who believes he can still save her, so he issues another meeting. Afterward, the townspeople gather in the mission house to hear what Grace says to everyone in town, especially the things she had endured. After her speech, she returns home, leaving the writer to deal with the townspeople. However, their response only proves how selfish Dogville's townspeople are, because after everything Grace had done for them, they only wish to turn her over to the gangsters. Other than that, they'd make the writer choose between them or Grace. The writer returns to Grace's arms after the meeting. He confesses his dedication to her over the town and attempts to have her that night, but Grace stops him, saying it'd be best if their love grows in freedom and not her as captive. The writer somehow shows frustration because she stops him, while the others have already touched her. Grace then replies he can have her, just like the rest of the town men who use force and threats. The writer believes his intentions are pure, but later realizes that his frustration originates from forcing himself, that he's different from the rest of the men in town when he's just like one of them. So the writer decides to call the gangsters to retrieve Grace. The movie ends with Chapter 9, showing the writer escorting the gangsters to Grace's shack, where they locked her up while asleep. The writer frees Grace from the chains and goes inside a Cadillac, revealing the gang leader, which is Grace's father. It turns out Grace ran away from her father due to her inability to tolerate his dirty works. Inside, they argue about issues of morality, where Grace finally understands that despite Dogville's poor circumstances, their crimes are inexcusable. When the writer realizes the gangsters are a threat to them and not to her, he apologizes. Still, he quickly rationalizes the misfortunes and mistreatments that happened to Grace as enlightening. As revenge, Grace orders his father's men to burn down Dogville from the map and make the teacher watch her children die one by one if she doesn't stop from crying. When all is left are ashes, Grace finishes the writer herself with a single bullet on the head. Before they go, they hear Moses barking and spare his life because it's only mad at Grace for stealing his bone. Everyone leaves, and Moses' chalk illustration turns into a real dog yapping until everything goes black. This is Daniel's CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.